So we've got the balance shaft apart. We've linished that journal there that runs on the balance shaft bearing. This side as well. Housing. There's no bushing on this side. That cover is the support on that side, and also the gear. You want to also make a note of how these come apart, because the little holes need to line up, or the timing for the balance shaft will be out. We're going to pull apart the rest of this housing. There's the corresponding mark, corresponds with that little dot there on the balance shaft. They're quite critical. And you've got the oil pump and the regulator valve there. On the other side, you've got your front main seal needs replacing, and I believe there's a little seal under here as well. I've got that timing gear off there, the little plug that goes under there, over here. And what that's for, when you're putting this back together, the way you do it is you get one gear, slide it in here, like so. Match up those little marks, the two little holes. You put your cover on. I still haven't pulled that pump apart. You put your cover back on, put your bolts back in. Put one there, just to hold it. And you'll notice that gear is sort of a little bit loose, but it has got like a square cut on there. And then basically what you do is you slide your balance shaft in, like so. Find where that slot is. There we go. Flip it over, and then you tighten up your bolt. That's the bolt that's holding the gear to the balance shaft. Replace the O-ring there, replace the seal, and you can put that plug back in. You just do that up after you've tightened that. And that's how you set that up. Now we use an impact driver to undo these because they're on fairly tight, and you've got your regulator valve that would need removal as well. Just be aware, I think there's a spring in there too. So we'll pull all that apart, give it a good clean, replace all the seals, well, the two metal clad seals, the O-ring, and there'll be another O-ring over here I believe, and we can put it all back together. Now we're going to use the impact driver to loosen those bolts off the oil pump, but if you just do that without supporting where that housing is, you can risk breaking that housing. So you're going to make sure that you have like a support, like a punch, and you just lean it on that just so it doesn't crack that housing. Now we're supporting the housing underneath with that punch. There we go. Next one. Lift your left hand up a bit, just level it up. There we go, that one was easy. Alright. That's a tight one. And you can see that the valve's still in there. Important not to damage anything while you're getting it out. So not to damage the valve, we're going to tap it on this bit of wood. And just let the weight of the thing come down on it, otherwise you'll hurt your hands. And there we go. That's what it looks like. That just comes out of there, and that's the pressure regulator valve. Now if that leaks anywhere, or if that's stuck like it was, carboned up in there, that'll affect the oil pressure. In an engine, the oil pressure is actually lube pressure. Like you have in a transmission, you've got line pressure and you've got lube pressure. In a motor, it's basically primarily for lube pressure. So we've just cleaned up the bore. No grinding paste, no nothing, just the valve on its own. And you want to be able to not feel any little resistance there. Thoroughly cleaned it all, knocked out all the seals, taken out the O-rings. We've linished the surfaces that run in the housings. The little spacer there on the end, we're going to actually flip it 180 degrees, because I don't know if you can see that. You can see that it's worn a groove in that little sleeve. And also you might note that the groove isn't right in the middle, it's to one side. So what that tells me is that the seal doesn't sit in the middle. So if I flip it over 180 degrees, it'll sit on a brand new spot there. So I don't need to replace that little sleeve. That's there. The pump gears, I've ran a very, very fine stone over it, just to make sure there are no rough edges. The same as you've got the drive gear, you've got the driven gear, the cover plate as well, just make sure there's no gouges in it. It's very important, if you've got anything that chews up a bearing like that, to thoroughly go through everything, clean out every little nook and cranny that you can, and check everything. For pressure regulator valve that runs in here, it was actually stuck in there. Where it shuttles to, it must have made a little burr there. So what we did, we put a little hose on here. It's got to be smaller than the diameter of the valve, so the hose isn't getting stuck in the bore there. And then by just putting tension on the rubber, up, down, left, right, and working it, you'll knock that burr out. I wouldn't advise putting any grinding paste or anything like that on it. You can also see that the valve is worn on, oh, what's that, probably a quarter of the valve. So chances are, because it was stuck, I couldn't see which way it came out and which way is worn, but chances are I'm going to put it back in a new spot anyway. Pressure regulator spring, they do collapse. I don't have the specs on what the length of it should be. Some people automatically put a little plate in there just so it's got a bit more tension there, so you increase your lube pressure through the whole thing. So it wouldn't probably hurt to do that as well, given we're going to put the old spring back in. Don't go too crazy with it as well, just slightly, a slight little thing, probably a mil. And the balance shaft, we've also linished where that runs on the bush, and over here where it runs in that housing there, and thoroughly blown out all the ports as well. There will be a lot of carbon and muck in there. So now we've washed this off thoroughly. We're going to just put the new seals in, O-rings, put it all back together. When you're assembling it, because there is a dry period of assembly, I'd always recommend to put a heap of assembly gel and engine oil on all the components. Now you'll notice on the gear, on the drive gear, it's worn on this side more than on this side, where the little step is. So that tells me that it's actually turning that way. Now if we could flip it over, it would be awesome, but we can't because of this step. And the same goes with the driven gear. You'll notice that it'll be worn on one side, which is this side on the right. So you can flip that over just so this contact is running in a new spot. Just going to knock the seals in. When you're knocking seals in, again, I have mentioned it earlier, but you want to double check that you don't knock that little spring out when you're tapping it in, and also just check that the spring is actually there. Now this stuff will just dissolve as soon as heat and a bit of oil hits it. We use this in the automatic transmissions as well. I've decided which way I'm going to put the gear. Now, there's no gasket that goes on that. The chamfer on those heads will actually pull it into place, so there's no guide pins or anything like that. But it's always a good idea to just get them close before you start tightening it. And it'll just sort of pull it into where it should sit naturally. And we've got this Phillips head screwdriver where we can put a lot of torque on it. If you don't have one of those, you can also fit a socket on the end of one of those. You find the one that's suitable. You find a good Phillips head that actually fits nicely in that little head, and then you can put some pressure on it and tighten it with a socket. You want to tighten these up pretty good. In this situation it can't go anywhere. Even if it loosens, it's just going to hit up against the front of the block. And it's a good idea to also put that on the crankshaft and just make sure it's nice and free. It's not, you haven't put something in amiss. Okay, now we can go on to the valve. Engine oil. Now the spring is 1 inch and 7/100 thou, probably about 43 mil. Now if you are serious about putting a little bit more tension there, boosting the pressure in there, might be easier just to put a little washer in there that fits in there. .22 mil. Okay, that part's done. Now we can assemble this part. That's the gears for the balance shaft. Now this gear actually goes through there, and then you've got the little pulley there that's bolted onto it on the opposite side, on the outside of the motor. This is still the inside of the motor. So that one goes in there, and this other one goes in here. Now what you have to do, if you notice, there are two little marks, two little holes there. They've got to line up, or your balance shaft weight is going to be out of whack if you just whack that in there and not line that up. So very important to line that up. You can't mess this part up because there's a slot on it. That's it, we'll line up that little mark there. And that basically lines up like that. Fit in the cover there where the gears run. I only touch that little bit there. All three bolts are the same size. little spacer went in that way. You can see where it's worn a groove in the lip, or the lip's worn a groove. And flip it over 180 degrees and that'll just run right next to that. We push that in. Now what we do is, you can see this little plug that goes on there. There's also an O-ring, that don't forget to put that in. You have a bolt that goes in there, and you'll see that that has a square cut on it. So I'm going to put a little bit of oil and assembly gel on there, like so. And we just push it in like so. There we go, it's gone all the way in. And now, looking through that little hole there, we put the bolt in. Now what you can do is you can sort of grip that in the vise here, just so you can torque that easily, or either that or hold it with a shifter here. There's the old one, new one. And a little cover there. Now if you're doing this in the vehicle, you would take that bolt off the balance shaft so you can slide all this, the oil pump off if you needed to. If you needed to do any work on that. So the balance shaft can spin nicely there, and it's actually spinning that there. You've got the little pulley that locates on there. As you'll see, there's a little square cut on it. And the timing mark that you need to align with that little slot there is actually there where my finger is when you're putting the timing belt on. So it's at the top. And I'm not going to tighten that up yet. I'll just leave it there. And of course you've got this little idler pulley, and that just sits in here. So I'll just put that back on. Good idea. If you get a timing belt kit, you'll get these pulleys in there. This one apparently wasn't done too long ago anyway. Okay. There we go. That part's ready to put on. Now we like to actually soak the gasket in oil, or cover it in oil so it doesn't stick to anything in case you have to pull it off at some stage. We've got the piston at top dead center. The keyway, you'll find, will go as you're looking at the front of the motor. It goes to the right. That balance shaft gear, then we've got this part, and it goes, I've actually marked it so we know which way it goes on. I don't like thinking about these things. And finally the timing gear pulley. If that's all lined up, top dead center, that mark there, or that little punch mark there, should line up with that there. And when we're putting the belt back on, we've got to line all those little marks up. And that associated balance shaft, the left hand side one, or passenger side one, just goes in there. Has got that little straight edge so you can't really muck it up. We'll just clean that up, scrape that gasket off. There we go, L1, and I've machined a chamfer on there. It is hardened steel, you just want to make it nice and smooth, just so it doesn't wreck that seal as you're pushing it in. Smeared oil all over the gasket so it doesn't stick to either surface. You also want to double check your gaskets if there's a little port that gasket doesn't block it up, especially with aftermarket gaskets and seals. Little spacer that we've machined the chamfer on. And the little pulley. We're on the side cover there that goes over that balance shaft. Important to put just a really light smear of Silastic on there. If there's no gasket for these, Silastic's the only way to go. And just make sure you put it really thin towards the middle. You don't want those little bits of Silastic breaking off and ending up mixing in with the engine oil and blocking up your pickup. We also like to let it just become a little bit dry, just so it doesn't stick.